Thank you, Rob. I'm not sure about the one-man think tank. Not sure at all. And Paul, thank you for the welcome to country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, I have to confess, this is the first time I'm facing the audience, because I've obviously spent a good 2 decades either directly in the press gallery or reporting from Melbourne via Canberra and other places. So forgive me if I stumble from time to time. Now, I think it's possible to tell the story of the long conversation between the migrant and the local in the very first contact from 1770 and 1788. Now, I think every new arrival has a version of the first contact story of James Cook. When the Yorkshire-born sailor claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain in 1770, the locals rejected the gifts he offered and took aim with their spears. Now, I'm quoting Cook. He said, "All they seemed to want was for us to be gone." Now, the migrant, of course, absorbs this insult with a whispered assertion of cultural superiority. The recipient of the sledge differs through time, but the substance hasn't altered. I think the English set the tone when they dismissed the locals as savages, incorrectly, obviously, and seized the country from them. Arthur Bowes Smythe, a surgeon on the First Fleet, thought Indigenous men were, quote, "stupid and indolent," close quote, but otherwise harmless. And this is what he wrote in his diary in 1788. "They did not appear hostile, their language is excessively loud and harsh and seems to consist of a very short vocabulary." That could be any continental or Asian migrant over the past 70 years, sneering at the yobbo or bogan. These lousy first impressions of the new arrival as alien and Aussie as moron are erased once the migrants join the mortgage belt and send their children to the top of the class, and the locals find, to their relief, that the country remains familiar and is more affluent. Sadly, of course, the two parties will cement their relationship by yelling together at the next intake. It's ever been thus. Now, the curious thing about our story as a migrant nation, and I'm not dismissing at all, obviously, the history before 1788, but the curious thing for me, and I've spent the last couple of years working on a new project on migration, is how little room, when I read back through all the history that's been written of the various waves of migration, how little room is given to economics. Migration, for most people, is a cultural story only, and depending on your perspective, the plot line is either that we are the world's greatest host or an irredeemably racist people. We worry that the new arrival will not become Australian, while the Americans never doubt that the migrant will embrace their identity. Now, consider that little dichotomy. Americans view migration as essential to their nationhood, recognising migrants literally made the United States. That is an economic story they tell themselves, and they've been telling it almost since foundation. Australians are more likely to define the benefits of migration, if they are to define the benefits, in terms of the food. As I said, this is a curious national trait, because Australians, I think we all agree, obsess about economics more than most people. Now, what I want to do in a very brief time that I've got here tonight, because I'm mindful of the fact that we've got the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader and a number of awards to present, is give you a very, very quick dissertation on migration, not as a story about the great food that my mother brought to Australia, but through the economic lens. A very simple story, and the data will bear this out. The periods of Australia's greatest prosperity are associated with large-scale migration. In the 19th century, not only did we have open borders for people, but we also had open borders for trade. Between the founding of Melbourne in 1835, which is really the birth of that version of multicultural Australia, and the peak of the land boom in 1891, Australia's GDP per person quadrupled over that 50-something year period. Our nearest rival, believe it or not, was the United States, and they only doubled their national income over the same period. So we grew twice as fast as the next best country over that 50-year period that we were running open borders with a very, very big migration program and free trade. Now, the flip side of that story, the weakest period, when we grew slower than any other nation on earth, was the first half century of white Australia, when we were being selective about migrants and we put the tariff wall up. Actually, growth is not quite the right word, because our national income stagnated. I'll give you a 40-year snapshot. From the end of open Australia to the Great Depression of the early 1930s, our national income was actually lower in the 30s than it was in the 1880s. Now, As I said, Australians obsess a lot about economics. It's a story we don't like to remind ourselves of. When we close the door, we lose pretty much our essence as a migrant nation. Now, we know, very familiar obviously with the post-war reconstruction, the countless waves from Europe, from Southeast Asia, and now from China and India. What I want to point out, which I'll tell you, it surprised me when I dug this data out. Australia today looks like no other country on earth. Australia today looks like what it was going to become in the 19th century before it closed the door of white Australia. These first surprising, unsettling decades of the new millennium have actually brought us back to the position we enjoyed when we were the world's richest people in the 19th century. For the second time in our history, an entire generation of Australians have been raised with no experience of the economic or social hardship currently felt in the United States or Europe. Think about that. We count off 24 years of uninterrupted growth. Just today, Melbourne's confirmed for the 5th year in a row as the most livable city on the planet. We've got 4 cities in the top 10. So we're obviously looking pretty good as far as the rest of the world is concerned. Whether we actually believe it or not at the moment is another matter, but I'll leave that to the politicians. Now, once again, our society reflects probably the best of the world back to it. The last time we were in this position was the 1870s, when we enjoyed our greatest advantage in living standards over the US and Britain. The population back then was split almost 50-50 between migrants and between the local born. Today we know almost half the population can be counted as first or second generation. 28% of the population are born overseas, another 20% people like myself with at least one parent who was a migrant. If you add 3% for the Indigenous population, you get to more than 50% with another idea of what Australia is to what people used to assume was the mainstream view of Australia. Now, in the past, regardless of whether the state had a high or low proportion of people born overseas, the distribution was actually in the same order. The British were on top, followed after the war by the Italians, and then from the 1970s onwards followed by the Kiwis, the New Zealanders at number 2. This meant that high and low migrant states remained broadly familiar to one another, that basically Australia, as it was evolving, pretty much looked the same, give or take the proportions for individual groups, from one state to the other. Today, and this is probably the most important take-out message, we're growing so fast now that we're actually moving in 3 different directions. One part leads towards China and India, another leads towards the mother country, and the third towards the Pacific. Australia's Eurasian self is concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne. Its Anglo-Celtic self is in Perth and in Adelaide, and that new Pacific identity I'm referring to is taking shape in Brisbane. The Chinese-born have already replaced the British as the largest overseas-born group in Sydney. The British are still number 1 in Melbourne, but they're going to fall to number 3 behind the Indians and the Chinese within a couple of decades. Among migrants aged under 35, in Sydney and Melbourne, the British are already ranked 3rd behind the Chinese and the Indians. In Perth and Adelaide, and as I've flagged, the British remain unchallenged with almost the same population share that they had under white Australia. So bear in mind, you have 2 very, very big cosmopolitan cities and 2 very, very Anglo cities out west. And in Brisbane, of course, the New Zealanders are now about to overtake the British as the number 1 overseas-born group. I think it's time to discard the old incantation that Australia is the sum of its Anglo-Celtic parts. Our migrant heritage may well be British and Irish, but our location has always been Asian. Now our demography is Eurasian. I'm going to do a very, very quick snapshot with the United States because this is the most fascinating detail about why we are so different to everyone else at the moment. Today, only one of the 50 US states has an overseas-born population comparable to Australia, and that's California at 27%. Only 2 others are above 20%, New Jersey and New York. All 5 mainland states are above New Jersey and New York, and New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia are much more diverse than California. Now, the most interesting part of this. Australia is actually increasing its diversity at the time when the Americans are losing theirs. Let's divide that 28%. Sorry to give you too many numbers, but this gives you an idea of how diverse this country is today. Of that 28, 10 percentage points are from Asia. 9 are from the old empire, Britain, Ireland, New Zealand and South Africa. 5 are from Europe and just under 2 from the Middle East. You would have to say that that is a pretty good multicultural mix. In the US, they've got a lower overseas-born population, 13% of their total, but 7 of that 13 is from Latin America. Only 4 is from Asia and less than 2 from Europe. So already Australia as a Eurasian country looks nothing like, the migrant part of Australia looks nothing like the US. There's obviously a logic to both flows. The ethnic faces of Australia and the US are now inexorably linked to their respective locations. Each are essentially bilingual nations. Australia's main languages are English and Asian ones. America's are English and Spanish. Given the shift in global economic power from the North Atlantic to Asia, Australia now enjoys, and this is a thing that should inspire us but should also challenge us, its greatest advantage over the US in the global competition for high-income migrants since the gold rush. In Australia's 3 cosmopolitan capitals, now remember I mentioned 28% of Australians are overseas born. In Sydney the figure is 39%. In Perth it's 37%. In Melbourne it's 35%. These proportions were last seen in the 1870s. And the second generation is roughly 25% in each of the 3 cities. So 2/3 of the population is either first or second generation. This is a magnificent story to tell, but I'll just give you 2 very, very quick bullet points of the policy challenges that come with this. Most of the migrants that land today from China and India pretty much have a 10 or 15%, based on the Migration Council's own research, 10 or 15% better earning capacity than the local born. So the migrants land in a much stronger position, say, that the migrants of my parents' generation did. That is obviously a big tick for the country. But the rate of growth in the migration numbers is actually gone way beyond, I think, the capacity of federal or state governments to be able to handle it. The very, very simple challenge of infrastructure. Melbourne at number 1 is not going to be number 1 much longer as a livable city if it starts to cross that 4, 5, 6 million figure and you start to get gridlock. Now the gridlock's not going to bother the newly arrived migrant because they'll be able to afford to live in the inner city. The gridlock is going to bother the local born who'll be sent further out in the outer suburbs. So first take-out message, this country is actually growing a lot faster than I think a lot of people realise. I don't think the political system's got its head around what capacity needs to be built to handle this population flow. The second thing, and it's actually linked to the first point, if the Chinese and Indians especially, and it's also true for British and American migrants, if they're landing essentially better educated than the local born, your education system needs to do a really big catch-up to make sure no one gets left behind. These are challenges of prosperity, these are challenges of success. The difficulty, I think, in the Australian political system is we've spent a lot of time talking ourselves down the last few years. The people are coming anyway, so sooner or later we're going to have to build capacity. So I'll leave it at that. It's a short, truncated version of a speech I would have liked to give, but given there are a lot of politicians in the room, I'm not going to give that speech. Rob, thank you.